What is up, ladies and gentlemen? Most of all you ladies out there. Thanks for clicking on another episode of Break the Silence. I'm your host, Cyborg. We got a new topic today that I'm very excited to discuss, as it is a little ways away from the normal teams we've been talking about on this podcast. For the most part, the duration of this, I've been talking mostly about the NBA playoffs and the Boston Celtics, a lot of their playoff run. We got the Warriors, the Bucks, the Heat, all those kind of teams. We've been discussing those. But I'd like to sit down and talk for a minute about a team that's no longer in the playoffs. We had breaking news yesterday as Coach Quin Snyder of the Utah Jazz stepped down from his current role and decided he wasn't going to be head coach of the Jazz anymore. And right now the Lakers are punching the air because they could have had a swing at Quin Snyder. And I want to just sit here and talk about, for a second, some of my thoughts as to what kind of happened here and where I think the Jazz go from here. Quin Snyder was the second winningest coach in Utah Jazz history, just behind Jerry Sloan, absolute legend. I got my Jazz jersey on here to represent the Utah Jazz, but the second winningest coach in Jazz history. He led the Jazz to the playoffs in the majority of his, I think, every year of his coaching career. And the farthest he ever made was the second round of the playoffs. He had two All-Stars in Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert. And actually, Mike Conley made an All-Star game in there, so I guess I should throw him in. So we left last season for the Jazz. This technically still going on, but the end of the season for the Jazz. It ended in the first round losing to the Dallas Mavericks, and I think we all felt like it was time for the Jazz to make a move from maybe their current roster or their current coaching staff or something like that. We just saw the Utah Jazz sign Danny Ainge, who was he was the GM of the Boston Celtics, came over to Utah, and they just got D-Wade. So you knew those guys aren't super dedicated to Coach Quinn. And so it wasn't surprising that change was coming. And I don't think we're done seeing change coming with the Utah Jazz. I think it was the time to fire Quin Snyder. In fact, you could have argued it was a year too late. But I talk, and you're going to hear me talk a lot on this show, about windows, about how NBA teams and sports teams in general have windows where it's their chance to win a championship. And if you miss that window, it might be another 15 years before another one opens. And the window for the Utah Jazz was last season, not this one that's still going on right now, the one before, when they were the 1 seed, and in the second round, they're playing the Clippers. They have a 2-1 lead, and Kawhi Leonard gets hurt. They would have then went on to the Western Conference Finals, where they would have played the Phoenix Suns, where Chris Paul was out the first couple games with COVID. And then Giannis was hurt going into the finals. So you had the Utah Jazz that felt like your golden opportunity to have a chance at the NBA Finals with this particular roster and this collection of talent. And they fell apart in the second round and let the Clippers beat them without Kawhi Leonard. And that felt to me like the window slamming shut on the Utah Jazz. And this year, you could tell just by how they played, they weren't the same team. They didn't have belief in themselves. Their mental toughness just wasn't the same. It's the same roster, but they were a much worse basketball team, because as soon as this goes, it's over. And the most direct correlation we have to the Jazz is the Boston Celtics from the year before. The Celtics were an Eastern Conference Finals team a couple times under Brad Stevens, I think 3 times under Brad Stevens, and they couldn't get over the hump. And then last year, they lost in the first round to the Brooklyn Nets. And they decided that it was time to, and they don't, and a lot of these teams don't say that they fired people or anything like that. But effectively, they decided to go in a different direction. Brad Stevens went to the GM. Quin Snyder decided to step down. I think that's just out of respect for Coach Q, who, by the way, needs to get some looser pants. That's the overwhelming most important thing, is that if he gets back in a head coaching spot, we got to loosen the pants. But you saw the Celtics then get a new coach and hear a new voice. And you have pretty much the same collection of talent, but it provided a new bolt of energy in the Celtics organization. When you're looking at the Jazz and where they're headed, you have to think, do you try to run it back with a different coach for one more year, or do you try to blow it up? Or do you try to make one big change that doesn't blow it up, but take one last shot at the finals? The reason that it's tough with the Utah Jazz is that they don't have a lot of strong trade assets. A strong trade asset is a young, talented player, usually on a rookie deal, things like that, good draft picks, someone that is not on a bad, someone you got on a really good contract, even if they're a veteran. But you have a lot of bad contracts in Utah. You have Mike Conley, who is a horrible contract. Bojan Bogdanovic, I could argue, is a little overpaid. And Royce O'Neal is not a great contract. You also have max contracts for Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert. So you have a lot of guys who are being paid significant amount of money for the Utah Jazz, and you're not going to see teams lining up to trade for Mike Conley because it's a bad contract, an older player who's got 2 more years left at being one of the highest paid players in the NBA. And the reality is that's a tough contract to move. Now, if you had 1 year left, it's a little easier to do. So I just spent the last hour in ESPN's trade simulator trying to put together a trade that I think that the Utah Jazz could potentially do to help their roster going forward. And to be honest, there's not much. The big asset that I thought would make a difference is Jeremy Grant. If you could somehow have gotten Mike Conley and Royce O'Neal and a first-round pick to the Pistons for Jeremy Grant, I don't know. I don't know if that changes the fortunes in Utah. I still think they would need a point guard because Donovan Mitchell is an excellent 2 guard, but he's not a point guard. The other interesting and so I just don't know that works. You then hear a lot of discussions talking about, do you trade Rudy Gobert? Do you trade Donovan Mitchell? There's rumblings now that Donovan Mitchell might want out of Utah. And if I'm the Jazz, I am doing everything I can to keep Donovan Mitchell, not just because he's a good basketball player, but because of his marketability in the community and at the stadium. And he's the first player in a decent amount of time that nationally people tune in to watch play for the Utah Jazz. You've had some excellent Jazz players in the last 10 years, but not all of them you tuned in to see. You had Al Jefferson. Rudy Gobert's not someone you necessarily tune in to see. Gordon Hayward was a really good player for the Jazz, but he's not someone that you tune in to see. Donovan Mitchell has that star power about him. So if I'm the Jazz, that's someone that I would like to keep. Now, there's a lot of grumblings that Gobert and Mitchell don't want to play together. And I don't know if that comes from them or not, but typically where there's smoke, there's fire. Unfortunately, that saying tends to be true most of the time, and you'll hear these players deny it, but most of the time it ends up being the case. Now, the question is, do the Jazz go the Celtic route and take one last flyer with their roster before trying to blow it up? And I think the Celtics, if they hadn't had a good year, would have said, hey, we can't win with Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum, Marcus Smart being our core. we got to do something here. So if I'm the Jazz, do you take a flyer? And hear me out. Do you take one last flyer on a Mike Conley for John Wall trade? Every Jazz fan that just heard that is going to say absolutely not. And I might agree with you on that. But when I was looking at the contracts that's similar to Mike Conley, now John Wall is the second highest paid player in the NBA, but he's only got 1 year left on his contract, so it's an expiring contract. And the reason that I say that is because you can have one last year where you try to make a run for it, and worst case scenario, you just cut bait with John Wall after 1 year. But the Mike Conley has 2 years left on his contract, so that's a really bad one. So if you're able to get rid of that, then it allows you to start the rebuilding process a year earlier than otherwise. So, in my opinion, if I'm the Jazz and I'm taking one last shot at it, I'm getting Conley out of there for whatever asset I can get. And John Wall at his best, now it hasn't been about 4 or 5 years that he's been at his best, was a real contributor to a good playoff team. Or, to a playoff team, I guess I should say. So, is that something that you take a look at? Because the other names that have contracts similar to Conley were Chris Paul, Russell Westbrook, John Wall. And I don't think the Suns would trade Chris Paul. And I think Russell Westbrook I would stay as far away from as I could. So, if I'm the Jazz, and I know my dad and brother are big Jazz fans, I know they're watching this right now saying this is the worst idea I've ever had. But I honestly think if you look at the contract situations, and if you're the Jazz, if you decide to keep Mitchell and Gobert and see if this new coach can figure something out, then I think it's the trade. I think it's the only option you have. And if it doesn't work, you blow it up in 1 year rather than this year. It is what it is. Otherwise, I think you got to trade Rudy Gobert or Donovan Mitchell or both of them and just say, let's completely start a rebuild. Now, the suitors out there, I don't know if you're. I mean, the question: could you do a Ben Simmons for Rudy Gobert trade? Would the Nets want to do that? Could you have Kyrie, Kevin Durant, and Gobert? Because you got so much shooting. You got Seth Curry out there. Could you have Gobert on the court? Maybe. Is that what the Nets need? Maybe. And honestly, Simmons might bring something into the Jazz, which, again, that's taking a huge risk. But like I said, without many tradable assets, your only shot is to take a big risk, like a Ben Simmons, like a John Wall. So, if I'm the Jazz going forward, I would take the Boston Celtics approach that was just laid before you. I'd do what I could to trade Mike Conley for any sort of point guard asset. Doesn't even have to be a good point guard, just a Ricky Rubio type player. Can you get Ricky Rubio out, which I think he's recovering from injury, but someone like that who maybe is cheaper? And then do you try to trade Royce O'Neal and Bojan Bogdanovic or something like that for another forward option? I think it'll be interesting to see what the Jazz do. You got Danny Ainge and Dwayne Wade, like I mentioned earlier, who will come in and aren't going to be afraid to mess things up and hit the reset button. So keep your eye out for the Utah Jazz, who they're hiring at coach. I've heard some names, including Terry Stotts. I personally am not a big fan of just tossing around coaches that have been fired other places. Now, Terry Stotts had some success with the Trailblazers to an extent. I don't know. I wouldn't be thrilled if I'm a Jazz fan if you signed Terry Stotts. But anyways, let me know what you think in the comments below. Where do you think the Utah Jazz go from here? Do you think they make a splash trade to try to take one last fling at a title run? Or do you think they blow it up this year? Or do they try to run it back one more time with the same squad that's just getting older? Cyborg out.